Processed foods are killing us.
People who ate highly processed foods had a 10% higher risk of all types of cancer.
Processed foods are the primary source of calories in the United States.
We have the majority of calories in America now is from fast foods and processed foods.
Processed food.
Processed foods.
Ultra-processed food.
Ultra-processed foods.
Ultra-processed food.
Ultra-processed foods are, quote, cheap industrial sources of dietary energy and nutrients plus additives and containing minimal whole foods. So, like Cheetos. Multiple studies have demonstrated that high intake of ultra-processed foods increase the risk of obesity, diabetes, and even death.
Processed foods, anything that your grandmother wouldn't recognize as food. So if that's canned soup, if that's frozen foods that are processed, if that's, sauces out of bottles, it's things that are made in factories.
Processed ingredients, things that have been processed by manufacturers that started like this, and they add synthetic chemicals, preservatives, all these additives into the food, and you see this on the shelf. This process here, this thing here is called processing the food. And then you see the finished product. Things like, chips or Pop-Tart, all these things that do not look like how they came out of the ground or off the tree or walking around in the pasture. Now, to some degree, you're gonna have to do some processing, but it's the addition of all these synthetic chemicals. And by the way, you turn the back of a label of a food item, packaged item, and read what's in there. If it has more than 5 to 7 ingredients, it is highly unlikely that it's a clean food.
Chips, candy, white bread, even some breakfast cereals, they are typically very high in fat, salt, and sugar. They are what we call nutrient poor and calorie dense. And basically, they're the things that we buy in the grocery store that can be stored in our pantry, long shelf life. Basically, they can withstand a nuclear holocaust, and they're not good for us.
This is why they are bad for us. Through feats of science and engineering, corporations have created foods that smack us right in the pleasure centers of the brain, and we continue to eat them, even after we shouldn't.
It can have a deleterious effect on your hormones. So these synthetic ingredients can disrupt your body's hormones and throw your hormones in a state of just panic, actually. So that's one reason. The other reason is that we believe that some of these synthetic sweeteners, for example, that some of these things actually can mess with your brain chemistry. Artificial sweeteners are 100 to 200 times sweeter than regular cane sugar. Sweeter. And so what happens is, when you consume these artificial sweeteners, you have this dopamine response in your brain, which is pleasure. Right? It's the pleasure reward pathway. So you eat all this sugar, your brain releases dopamine, the dopamine travels in your brain, it goes to your pleasure center and says, oh, I feel good. So you know what I'm gonna do?
Again.
I'm gonna get more.
Yep, again.
Right? Because it's like Pavlov's dog, right? So we keep going, it's a conditioned response. We keep going to it. So what happens is this: when you eat these synthetic sugars, particularly where I'm right now, when you eat these sugars, you crave more sugar.
Okay.
And more and more and more. And eventually, you know what you're gonna do? You're gonna get regular cane sugar.
Yeah.
And you're going to consume it like crazy.
When you're consuming processed food, the sugars, the glucose, the fructose, the sucrose, the digested starch, gets absorbed in the first part of the intestine very rapidly and goes straight to the liver. The liver gets overwhelmed, and it has no choice but to take the excess energy and turn it into fat. When your liver turns energy into fat, that's when disease starts. That's what causes chronic metabolic disease, such as type 2 diabetes, heart disease, fatty liver disease, polycystic ovarian disease, cancer.
Why we have almost everybody in America develops heart disease, and we see it as being normal. Everybody in America gets cancer. If they don't get heart disease, they get cancer. It's like everybody in their family is getting it. If you had everybody in your family getting shot by a gun or with a bullet, you'd say, get out of that neighborhood. It's so ubiquitous, we see it as completely normal. And now 1 in every 5 Americans have mental illness, depression, or intellectual problems where they can't concentrate. And we see it as just being normal. And the explosion in autism, the explosion in learning disabilities, we don't trace it back to the cause.
Cooking does not take that long. What takes the most time is deciding what you're going to have for dinner and then going to the store to shop for it. If you go to a standard restaurant, in the time that you were ordering and waiting for your food, you could have cooked. So the goal today is to educate people on how to cook.
Get back to your kitchen. Cook at home.
And the more you eat green, the more you get lean.
Eat from the farm, not the factory. Your waistline will thank you and your body will be healthy.